Welcome to Prairie Pulse. I'm Matt O'Lean sitting in for John Harris. Coming up later on Prairie Pulse, we'll profile the North Dakota State Poetry Out Loud champion Julia Johnson from Fargo-Shanley High School. But first, my guest is Winnipeg author Sandra Sukan. Her book is In Search of the Blue Lotus, and thank you for being here, Sandra.
Thank you, Mal.
Before we get started, just tell folks about your background, where you're from originally, how you became an author.
Originally, I was born in what used to be British Guyana. It's now known as Guyana. It's on the northern coast of South America, so people who like to locate it can think of it as the east side of Venezuela, north of Brazil, and bordering on the north side with the Atlantic Ocean.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get into how you arrived in Winnipeg and how you became an author, but tell us about that journey, where back when you came from Guyana to Winnipeg. How did that happen? What were the circumstances, and what's the book about?
So my journey is probably a little different than most people might have as a regular journey. I arrived in Winnipeg for an arranged marriage. My marriage was arranged when I was 15, a year before. So I came over in 1970. I was 16 years old. I arrived in Winnipeg on July 20th, and by August 1st I was married to a man I'd met the year before, but he was staying next door to where I was living, and he was asked to go and find a wife. And I was not in the equation. I was just a young girl looking on at all this activity. And I think after a couple of weeks, his uncle decided that I might be someone he could at least look at and think about and get married to, and he could mold me into the kind of woman he wanted because I was young.
Mm-hmm. And is that what the book's about, your life journey? Tell us about the book and why you decided to write it.
The book actually was part of my doctoral dissertation. I was at the time doing my doctoral studies in environmental studies. And I was asked to write this chapter because my committee felt I had this very interesting background. I grew up in what used to be a colony. It became independent while I was still a child. I moved to Canada for this arranged marriage. Had a very kind of traditional role of a wife staying at home looking after the children. And then my kids grew up and I went back to school, and I became a hairstylist. I went to school and got a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a second master's degree, and here I was doing my doctoral dissertation. And they thought that this would be good to write, to tell this story. I didn't really want to do it because at the time my dad had terminal cancer, and I was really focused on managing his health care, so it just seemed like work to me.
Now in the book, do you express your thoughts about what it was like to leave Guyana, what it's like to be in an arranged marriage? I mean, this must have been a very, very trying time for you. You also talk about threats that were made against you and your family in Guyana at the time. Can you talk about that?
So I mean, culturally speaking, arranged marriages were relatively common, although my parents didn't have an arranged marriage. When my marriage was arranged, I really, at first when my dad approached me with this, I thought he was joking, so I sort of laughed as a 15-year-old would. And then after several days of telling me to go back and think about it, I realized that he wasn't joking. I was supposed to say yes, except it took me a few days to realize I was supposed to say yes. And then once we got engaged, my fiance and he came back to Canada. He was living in Canada at the time. And these anonymous letters started arriving. Mm-hmm. The first one saying, he doesn't really love you, you should really break it off. I was pretty happy to do that because I didn't really want to get married anyway at 15. But then more letters kept coming. And the rhetoric just kept getting more serious. And by the time I was ready to come to Canada a year later, or I guess 10 months later, the person, always anonymously, had made it clear in the letter in big, bold letters that if you come to Canada for this marriage, I will kill you. So that was kind of how I was arriving in Canada, with my disguise of sunglasses, which I have to say are not really good disguises. And so my reluctance to come to Canada was twofold. One, that I didn't know the person I was marrying. And secondly, that it was kind of under threat of death. Mm-hmm. I think I was upset with my parents for a good amount of time for making me go anyway. And so I arrived here feeling pretty stressed. And I think in 1970 people didn't talk about culture shock. I mean, it wasn't something you knew or you talked about. You just arrived and you started to live your life. So it was a pretty anxious time, a very trying time, stressful time, really missing my family. I talked about the loneliness. I grew up, my sister was very, very close to me. We slept in the same bed from the time we were babies. So me missing my family and my friends, I was very sociable and social in school, and arriving in Canada with no friends, no family. I mean, my mom came for the wedding, but she left the day after I got married. So that was a difficult time.
Did you ever find out where the threats came from?
That's a question that I often get asked, like, so did you ever resolve that? And I think after 44 years, I'm not even interested. I never did find out who, and I'm not sure that I even care to find out. I mean, if it happens, it happens, but I think at some point when I was young, I came to the realization that I needed to live my life. I needed to stop living it in fear. And I don't think it was a conscious decision. It was just something I think I arrived at, that if someone is going to kill me, they're going to kill me. And I just have to live my life. So if it's going to be sudden, that's what it's going to be.
Was it therapeutic to write the book?
Surprisingly, it was, because people ask me sometimes, it's written in the form of a diary. So it looks like you're reading my diary. So every entry starts with "Dear Diary," something, "Dear Diary." So my diary became kind of my friend, the person my inner self that I talked to. And so I didn't want to write the book, but once I started writing it, I couldn't stop writing. I didn't really know where to stop because there was just so much I had in my head and so many experiences I wanted to talk about, that when I finally wrote it, I felt this sort of sense of relief that it's down there and I don't have to keep it in my head and have it cluttering the space in my head. So, yes.
What was Guyana like in the 1960s when it was still under British?
I mean, as a child, you have different kinds of experiences. So, as a young child, we had a fairly big backyard. We would run around. I learned to ride my bike, climb trees. My friends, we'd play in the backyard. And then in the sort of early to mid-60s, things started to become difficult. We were a British colony. The British had decided at that time to have this sort of divide and conquer along racial lines. So people who we knew as friends were not supposed to be our friends anymore.
Right.
So I'm Indian. My ancestors come from India and the Middle East. And there was this conflict with blacks. And so we had these tensions, except we didn't really understand what that meant because we grew up in a small community where blacks and Indians just lived very harmoniously. So it's pretty hard to tell your nanny, to understand why you're suddenly not supposed to, like your nanny anymore. So those were difficult times for us, trying to figure out what it meant to be. I think as a child, you don't really think about whether you're Indian or black. But for me, it always was a question about why are we, what does it mean to be black? And why are we not supposed to like these people? And why are we not supposed to go and eat at these people's homes? That was very confusing for me.
I know this is a question you get a lot too. Are you and your husband from the arranged marriage still together? I know the answer.
Yes, it's 44 years.
Because he's watching us right now in the studio.
Yes, and we're still together, yes. People always, that's one of the questions whenever I do a book reading or some presentation, people always ask me that question.
Is it a different marriage now than it was at the beginning? Obviously, but tell us, and I'm sure you write about this in the book, I know you do, how that has changed over the years.
I think over the years, well, when we, of course, first got married, I really didn't have a sense. He was just, I was 16, he was in university, I was in high school. We didn't really have a kind of any common parts of our lives because I wasn't old enough to do things that university people would do, and he wasn't interested in doing things that high school people do. So although we spent time together, he spent a lot of time studying and I spent a lot of time alone. Even though I lived with my in-laws, I had a younger brother-in-law and sister-in-law who I spent time with. But our relationship wasn't really, I think, solidified until we moved out on our own and we had our own home and we started to work towards the same goals, buying a house, maybe having a family. And over the years, money was very, very tight because I think we had also made the decision that I would stay home and take care of the children and he would go to work. So I took on all the roles of being sort of the traditional housewife and whatever that meant. So I took care of the kids and the house and the laundry and the yard and my husband went to work. And over the years, I think once my daughters started to grow up and become more independent and go to school, I started school. There was always this question about whether I should go to school and whether I should, get more education than he has. And this became an issue not between the two of us, but through our extended families. Because in my culture, women are not supposed to have either more money or more status or more education or more anything. You're supposed to be lesser than your husband. And so this was always a question that we were asked, like, isn't he going to mind? But I think maybe I was either convincing enough or he was, open enough to have me, I guess, grow in the direction I wanted to.
My guest is Sandra Sukan from Winnipeg. Again, her book is In Search of the Blue Lotus, and you eventually did go to college, earn a doctorate in environmental studies. Tell us about that and some other things that you did along the way.
Well, it seems sort of difficult for people to understand sometimes that a hairstylist can have a doctorate. I think those social class lines oftentimes get drawn and you don't cross them. So I wanted to be a hairstylist. And I think in later years, I realized that it was the privilege that I enjoyed in my young life that even made me think that I could be a hairstylist. I never had to really think about it. It's just something I wanted to do, and I just assumed that I could do it because my parents always told me that I could be anything I want except a hairstylist, because that wasn't what smart people did. And then, it was one of my clients when I was a hairstylist who said, I think you'd be a really good teacher. And I had totally rejected that after high school. I wanted to be a hairstylist, and that's all I wanted to be. And she said, just go to, Red River College and talk to someone there about the teacher education program. And it was like, I felt like, in retrospect, I felt like I was like a sponge, just soaking up everything. I started doing the courses. I was actually really good at it, which was kind of a surprise because I hadn't gone to university. And then that, finishing that program, I got a scholarship. I went to university. It was a very small scholarship. I mean, it was only $1,200. But I also got offered this $50,000 job and sort of decided, well, the $1,200 scholarship sounds much better than the $50,000 job. I mean, logically, it doesn't kind of make sense to people if maybe you live your life based on what you value. Right. And for me, I valued this education, I think, because I'd been out of school for so long and wanted to go back to school, that's the route I decided to take. And then after I finished, I ended up going into a master's program, and it just sort of snowballed from there. And I call myself kind of an accidental student, that although I love school, that was not my intended path. I didn't intend to, if someone said, are you going to do a doctorate? No. Are you going to go to university? No. Are you going to do a master's? No. And that was kind of the route I ended up in. And so the doctoral studies really came out of my work as a hairstylist. I worked as a tradesperson for a long time. I taught in the trades. I'm familiar with the apprenticeship, how it works. And I think I really felt strongly that the way we train vocational teachers doesn't work. The way we train them in a university model does not work. And I was advocating for a different kind of pedagogy for these teachers. And so when people say, well, what does a doctorate in environmental studies have to do with hairstyling? Everything, and I don't want to say nothing. It has everything to do with that, because really what I'm interrogating are the social systems that, or systemic sort of injustices that keep people as hairstylists or as scholars, and like the two worlds aren't supposed to meet.
Right. What's the title of the book mean? It's kind of a metaphor, right?
Yes, it is. In Search of the Blue Lotus, it's really, the blue lotus is really a real flower. And and it symbolizes a kind of like a higher spiritual place, a kind of a self-actualized person. I guess I'm going to use that analogy. And this search for the Blue Lotus is really a search for a kind of a spiritual place in your life, not a religious place, but some place that transcends the sort of the normal, ordinary life. You're always aspiring to be better emotionally, spiritually, intellectually than you were the day before. Not that being a hairstylist isn't rewarding, but you should aspire to be the best hairstylist you can be, or the best person you can be. So that's the Blue Lotus that I'm looking for. And of course the book has a subtitle which seems rather daunting to people, a feminist counter-narrative to the dominant hegemonic discourse. And sometimes people will pull out their little phones to check to see, like, what is this hegemonic discourse that you talk about? And people who look at it and who know me and look up the words, oh, well, yes, that's you. Because, I'm very political, and but not in a sort of an obvious politician kind of a way.
Right.
I think I'm political and in an activist kind of a way, and I think we all are, most of us in parts of our lives. We take on those roles of activism. I just happen to write mine. And
You talk in the book about being complicit in kind of post-colonial race issues, the stuff you've gone through. What do you mean by that?
well, I don't want to make myself sound like a saint, and I'm not holy and I'm not perfect. So oftentimes within the systems that I operate, I'm challenging those sort of systemic kinds of biases that maintain the status quo. But I realize that I'm also part of that system. I was colonized. I grew up in a colony. So my learning is in a kind of a colonial context, and I'm always questioning that colonial context. So while I'm trying to fight that system, there are times when I am part of that system that creates those boundaries, and those need to be broken down, and I need to question myself, like, why did you do that? Why did you say that? And or if someone says to me, why did you tell me that? For me to step back and say, okay, that wasn't, I really need to rethink that. And in the book I talk about my experience in Botswana. I mean, obviously you can look at me and tell I'm not white, but I taught about white privilege, at least from the perspective of a non-white and the person who doesn't have that white privilege. And then I went to Botswana in 2006, and a young student who hadn't graduated from high school said, Mama Sandra, we really love spending time with you. We love what you're doing for us, but you realize the reason you got that opportunity to go to the radio station for the interview is because you're white. And that really, it became actually my master's thesis, because suddenly I was questioning my own identity. What did I mean about when I'm teaching about whiteness from a non-white perspective? What did I think that meant? Was it just the color of my skin? To her, it wasn't that. It was really about the things I had that symbolized whiteness.
What's been the reaction to the book quickly, and then how can people get the book if you have a website or something like that?
The reaction has been really, really super. I've had a lot of support for it. I'm getting a lot of readings, people requesting me to do presentations. And the book is available through me. My email address is just sandrasukan@hotmail.com, or my phone number, 204-488-2628.
Is it in bookstores in Winnipeg?
It's in
the region?
McNally
Okay.
Robinson,
Great.
and also through Friesen Press.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sandra, so much for being here.
Thanks very much.
My guest today has been Sandra Sukan, Winnipeg author of the marvelous book In Search of the Blue Lotus. Stay tuned for more.
In 2013, as a sophomore, Julia Johnson surprised herself by winning the Fargo-Shanley Poetry Out Loud School Championship. But a blizzard prevented her from going to Bismarck to compete in the state competition. The disappointment of that drove Julia to achieve her goals as a junior in 2014. And recently, Julia not only won the Shanley School title again, but she also finally made it to Bismarck and won the 2014 state championship. When you watch Julia recite poetry, you understand why she is the North Dakota state champion.
I am the people, the mob, the crowd, the mass. Do you know that all the great work of the world
Poetry Out Loud is a competition that starts in your classroom and then it moves up through a couple different levels. Then you end up doing a larger school competition, and whoever wins the school competition will go on to the state competition. And then who is ever crowned the winner of that will go to the national competition in Washington, D.C. If you make it to state, you are supposed to have 3 poems prepared, and there are basically 2 requirements. One poem has to be 25 lines or fewer, and then one has to be pre-20th century. To find my poems, I went to the Poetry Out Loud website online, and they have a whole anthology of poems, and there are hundreds of poems on there. It takes a while, especially if you're going from A to Z, but there's a poem out there for just about anyone. The judges aren't necessarily looking for like massive hand gestures or anything. They're seeing how well you can convey the poem and the poet's message through your voice, like the tone of your voice. So they're not looking for it to be big and almost theater-ish, but they're looking at it to be more that you can actually understand the message without all of that.
Vigil strange I kept on the field one night, when you, my son, and my comrade dropped at my side that day. One look I but gave, which your dear eyes returned with a look I shall never forget. One touch of your hand to mine, O boy, reached up as you lay on the ground. Then onward I sped in the battle, the even contested battle, till late in the night relieved to the place, at last again I made my way.
Going into the state competition, I wasn't necessarily nervous because I was very confident with my poems. I knew that I knew them, and so it was more just excitement and those butterflies. But then once you get up there and you say your title and everything, then everything just goes clear and you just perform.
And the North Dakota State finalist, first prize, is Julia Johnson, Shanley High School. Congratulations.
When they started announcing 3rd place and 2nd place, I thought that I was somewhere up there, but after they said 2nd place, I was like, I think I've got this. And then they said my name. I was shocked for a little bit, and then I stood up and I was like, okay, this is real.
When I first started kind of looking at poetry, and when it started like freshman and sophomore year, I didn't really know what I was reading. I was like, it's just poems, it's a bunch of words. But now that I actually like look deeper into the meaning of poetry out loud, and you actually start looking at your poems, and you're not just memorizing your poems, you're learning your poems. You are completely understanding them, and you know them inside and out, and you almost feel like you're with the poet as they were writing it.
It was a picture I had after the war. A bombed English church. I was too young to know the words English or war. But I knew the picture. The ruined city still seemed noble. The cathedral with its roof blown off was not less godly.
I am very happy that I participated in Poetry Out Loud. It has taught me how to step outside of my boundaries.
I don't do any theater or anything like that. I'm normally just a sports girl, but this has been something completely new, and it's been such an adventure, and finding that I am good at something like this, it's quite exciting.
The first poem that I said today was I Am the People, the Mob by Carl Sandburg. I was trying to find a poem that I thought would fit my voice and one that I could really convey the poet's message. The poem starts talking about how all these great people in history, they come from the same place. We all come from the same community, but terrible things happen, natural disasters happen. Once we learn to learn from our mistakes, then we're going to grow as a whole.
I Am the People, the Mob by Carl Sandburg. I am the people, the mob, the crowd, the mass. Do you know that all the great work of the world is done through me? I am the working man, the inventor, the maker of the world's food and clothes. I am the audience that witnesses history. The Napoleons come from me, and the Lincolns. They die, and then I send forth more Napoleons and Lincolns. I am the seed ground. I am a prairie that will stand for much plowing. Terrible storms pass over me. I forget. The best of me is sucked out and wasted. I forget. Everything but death comes to me and makes me work and give up what I have, and I forget. Sometimes I growl, shake myself and spatter a few red drops for history to remember. Then I forget. When I, the people, learn to remember. When I, the people, use the lessons of yesterday and no longer forget who robbed me last year, who played me for a fool, then there will be no speaker in all the world say the name the people, with any fleck of a sneer in his voice or any far-off smile of derision. The mob, the crowd, the mass will arrive then.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week, and as always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the North Dakota Council on the Arts and by the members of Prairie Public.